Welcome to another episode of the Modus Nutrition Podcast. I'm Dr. Pastore, and today I'm actually honored. One of my dear friends for many years, I think we go back about 2 decades, is my guest today. This is the great Ben Velasquez. Ben is an award-winning, nationally recognized, sought-after strength and conditioning coach and performance rehabilitative specialist to professional athletes and corporate executives. This I can really vouch for. Ben has this weird sixth sense ability. Sorry that I'm calling it weird, Ben. Where he can actually, I actually think he can smell an injury on an athlete and how to fix it. But in all seriousness, he has this like intuitive sense to evaluate individual ability of an athlete and where they're hurting and how they're hurting, and then determine a suitable corrective action for overall improvement. He's delivered well over 200 seminars to over 1,000 sports professionals. In his professional career, he's the founding partner and director of human performance for Sports Lab NYC LLC. That was here in beautiful New York City. Right now, Ben is the president of Gray Matters Sports Group, and there's exciting topics to talk about there, because for the last 2 years, Ben has been spending time researching the use of corrective exercise in mitigating the risk factors of concussions in athletes. Along with his team at Gray Matters Sports Group, Ben also successfully worked with athletes from 5 different sports that were recovering from multiple concussions. And we definitely will be talking about that today. Ben and his team have pioneered a 5-tier method of rehabilitating an athlete that has suffered from concussive trauma. And Ben's background, in addition to his bachelor's science degree in aeronautical science, Ben holds several certifications, which include an NCSA certified strength and conditioning specialist credential, licensed performance soma trainer, ACSM exercise specialist, ISSA sports performance nutritionist. I could go on too long with letters of the alphabet, so I'm going to stop there. And then Ben's client roster includes multiple NHL, MLB, Division I NCAA soccer, NFL, even the women's track team at University of Texas, to world championship boxers, Olympic athletes. He had like 5 of them back when the Sydney Olympics of 2000. Ben's got an extensive career in pro sports. With that intro, Ben, thank you so much. Welcome, and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Robert. That was quite the intro. I'm gonna have to put that on my smartphone so that I can hear that. That was awesome, buddy. Thank you. I appreciate it, and thank you, and to your listeners for having me on the show.
It's an absolute pleasure, and you should cut some of that as your lead into leaving you a voicemail. That'd be a good segue. Ben, it's something we've never talked about all the years we know each other, the basics. Could you talk a little bit about your background and what led you on your current career path?
My undergraduate degree was in aeronautical engineering, aeronautical science. It's a double major, and essentially I wanted to work in that field, in the aviation field. When I graduated, I did for about 18 months. I worked for an airline, and I didn't like it. So I went back to school, and I studied physiology and got a degree in physiology. And then I started in corporate fitness, working here in New York at a place called Park Avenue Squash and Fitness Club. So we used to write corporate fitness programs back when, guys were playing squash and working on Cybex machines. Yeah. So I did that for a few years, and I gained it. Being an athlete, a former athlete, I played some baseball at high level. I wanted to work with athletes. So I was fortunate enough to get my start in professional hockey. And for a couple of years, I went back and forth to Western Canada to work with the WHL, in particular the Saskatoon Blades in Saskatchewan. And I used to write all of their programs for this WHL team. So I got a lot of experience kind of in the trenches with young athletes. That helped me to get into the NHL and work with individual athletes in the off season. And I did that for quite a number of years, primarily in NHL, some football, worked with a lot of track and field. And then I realized that I didn't have enough time in the off season to get these guys right because most of them were hurt. So I thought about going back to school to study PT, but the PT model here in North America was very how could I say, it was very secular and limited, it was not what it is in Europe. It was not what it was in other parts of the world. So I decided to take a non-accredited course in physiotherapy from France. It's an osteopathic course, and it was given by a gentleman who's one of my mentors, Dr. Guy Voyer, who is a PhD and an MD. As well as an osteopath. He's a really interesting guy, probably a savant when it comes to the human body. So I studied with him starting in 2004 and started doing more rehab and had a lot of success. That's when we would share a lot of our athletes with you, Robert. We worked with a lot of baseball in 2012, and it was a combination of rehabilitation, performance, and for me, it's one big gray area now, which we'll talk about. And then about 3.5 years ago, when the concussion thing really started to hit the media hard, I started within the evaluation asking the athletes how many have had concussions in their history, and the number was pretty astounding. It was probably close to 80%, which meant that every athlete that we sat on the table at Sports Lab had an 80% of them had at least one event, at least one concussion. So I said, wow, there's something to this. And that's when my engineering background helped, because there was nothing that was offered from an exercise component for these athletes. In other words, there was no rehab for them because it was a brain injury, in quotes. And so I started kind of looking at what are the mechanical components of a TBI? How do they affect the body's posture? How do they affect the body's ability to accept energy and communicate energy, or accept kinetic energy, ground force, however you want to call it, and communicate it? And that's kind of what's been happening for the last 2.5 years, is how do I apply the engineering concepts to helping an athlete to rehab and or to mitigate the risk factor for contact sports.
Wow. So that leads to a question I was going to ask you, what got your interest, because I know you're interested in concussions, Ben. So it really was Sports Lab and these athletes, and you seeing that 80% risk, which is just off the charts, of everyone that you were seeing for your daily work had that risk. And I mean, I was in that pool at the same exact time, and I was just in shock at how poor the treatment options were. I mean, a lot of medical doctors at the time that I was exposed to was just prescribing various types of steroids to try to reduce some inflammation. It really was a medication, go in a dark room, nobody really doing anything to work with these athletes physically. I've never heard of it. I've never seen a playbook coming out of medical schools back at that time that was being done to address these athletes. You know, that's a huge thing. So that I'm so glad to know that was your introduction. Can I ask, other than you seeing the lack of the physical treatment aspect, was there anything else that you felt that was just lacking in the world of concussions?
Yeah, I think there's more than one study, but there's definitely one study to link the increase in the likelihood of an orthopedic injury post-concussion. So I believe you're 40% more likely to suffer an ACL injury if you've had one or more concussions.
Wow.
And finding that. So I guess the point of saying that was that the athletes that have had multiple orthopedic injuries were putting themselves at a higher risk factor for being more susceptible to a TBI, because those mechanical injuries were either not rehabbed properly or the neurological aspect of them wasn't addressed. And so there was for me, there was a light bulb effect. It was like, oh, wait a minute. Like, you know, these guys that are in non-contact sports are suffering real TBIs with no contact, but they have a history of mechanical injuries. So what's the link there? You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
Yeah, so that's kind of the way we're looking at it now, where we're not looking at it as a concussion, we're just looking at it as another injury. And how do you look at it globally and assess either, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Was it the ankle sprain you got 2 years ago, or
Mm-hmm.
was it the TBI you got 2 years ago? And where are you today?
I definitely want to talk about rehabilitation. I don't want to leave this amazing. I think we're going to have amazing. I was going to say the amazing dialogue on concussions. I think we're going to constantly have that peppered in the whole dialogue. But always, for me, Ben, that really triggers something in my own brain, because the way I've always focused my work, my thoughts on concussion is just knowing the neurometabolic cascade post TBI. There's just some very well-known pathways that transpire. There's this like non-specific depolarization and initiation of some action potentials within the brain. There's the dumping of excitatory neurotransmitters, which of course can throw off your gait, which then leads to injury, especially if that's your career, your job. There's a massive efflux of potassium, increased activity of membrane ionic pumps that are just desperately trying to restore homeostasis, because obviously you're throwing off the sodium potassium pump if you're like seriously losing and depleting potassium from that area. I've also been fascinated with the hyperglycolysis, kind of to generate more cellular energy in the brain, adenosine triphosphate, but then also the lactate accumulation has always been something on my mind. The calcium influx, people don't realize how, calcium is such an important thing. I get its work in our bones and skeletal system and so many other facets, and voltage gated calcium channels. We obviously need calcium to store and launch and release neurotransmitters. But if you have calcium pouring into a cell, it actually causes damage to a neuron. That's why we have calcium binding proteins outside cells that prevent that type of damage, so they can cause some problems. And calcium influx usually transpires with sequestration. It's like sequestered within the mitochondria, leading to like impaired oxidative damage. And then the last two things that I think of is this decrease in adenosine triphosphate and an upregulation of these calcium binding proteins that are just not working so well, which initiates apoptosis or cell death. So just the things I listed would lead you to have gait issues and injury issues and all the problems that we see within concussion. And I'm starting to feel dumb that I never made the connection between there's a frequent set of injuries. Here's a concussed athlete. I'm thinking of all the neurochemistry, chicken or the egg. Right? That's really fascinating. And then I go back to the body blow syndrome. So with your boxers, we think of the great one, Muhammad Ali, right? Wasn't there a saying, I've never seen a study on it. I think there's some papers on body blows, but wasn't there studies on boxers that are really great at protecting their head, do not risk a reduction or benefit from a reduction in concussions, taking all those body blows and how the brain is moving in the skull?
Yeah, that's another rabbit hole, Robert, for sure. I mean, from to the first part of your point, I think that's what we're seeing now. If your expertise is obviously the biochemistry, and what we're seeing now is that we have to get the biochemistry in order first, in order for the brain to have more ATP, to be able to increase that neurological threshold, which allows the athlete to rehab from the injury. So it's like, how can I have more fuel in the tank to allow the rehab to occur and the brain to heal itself, which it will do. And that is basically what's my current biochemistry. So, what was the environment prior to the event? So did you have a shitty diet, or, did you have all of these elevated inflammatory markers for whatever reason? And that event for you turns out to be an 8 out of 10. For another athlete, it's a 2 out of 10 because they had a much better environment. So yeah, we're on the same page with that. And then as far as the injuries are concerned, for me, any injury that's not rehabbed properly, for me, is going to affect the central nervous system. And if the central nervous system is in any way leaning towards a sympathetic state, so the fight or flight mechanism for your listeners, that has a whole biochemical cascade, but more importantly, that is not allowing that is making the athlete more susceptible to a TBI much lower intensity. So, the same contact that may have had no effect on Robert has a huge effect on Ben because I didn't rehab my knee properly. And so the homeostasis of the body has been altered in a way where you're just more susceptible. And and to your point, the body blows, it's not necessarily brain contact anymore. They're looking at impulse injuries, which you can get from a body blow. You can get from a shock wave if you're a soldier in Iraq. And it could be misconstrued as PTSD when in fact you had multiple subconcussive trauma. Mm-hmm. And so it's all this new world of information that we're trying to kind of piece and put together. But it's very exciting because it offers possibility where there wasn't possibility before. There's countless players in non-contact sports that have had to retire because they couldn't rehab properly.
Wow. Can you talk about that, Ben? So as someone who specializes in these professional sports rehabilitation space, mm-hmm. Can you walk us through the process of assessing and recommending a course of action for an injured athlete?
Yeah, so I started a group called Gray Matter Sports Group, which started off as being a practice of professionals like yourself that were dealing with athletes in different spectrums of their performance and well-being. And we wanted to be able to refer back and forth athletes that we wanted to rehab from concussions. But it's kind of grown into a think tank because all the information is coming at us so fast, both anecdotally and research-based. And so we essentially share information on a monthly or a quarterly basis as to what anecdotal results that we're getting in our practice. And in my particular practice, I work with an osteopath, I work with a chiro, I work with a functional medical doctor that does all the blood work and does all the nutrition. And then I handle the mechanical aspect. So an athlete will come in and, like I've said, they've probably been to a lot of places before and they haven't gotten the results or haven't been happy. So they come here and we do a complete neurological and mechanical evaluation on them in my office. And they get their blood work done. And they also do something what's called a VOR test, which is a vestibular ocular test to look at essentially the GPS of the body. So they're looking at the eye function, the inner ear function, what information is the brain getting as to where that athlete is in space? What's the blood work saying as to where that athlete, how that athlete is monitoring their biochemistry? And then mechanically, what does that look like to me? If what's the guy's resting heart rate when he sits in the office? What's their HRV after a couple of days? How do they manage their gravity line? If they exercise for 10 minutes on the bike, do they get symptoms coming back? So we look at that. It's very, very subjective.
Okay. Now, I could imagine one big challenge is the athlete that they have to go through surgery. They blew out a knee. It requires surgical repair, maybe another part of the body. How much of a wrench in the machinery is that for what you're trying to do with your colleagues, if at all?
Yeah, so generally, most orthopedic surgeons at that level that are dealing with athletes are very good. So the work that they do, for the most part, is very, very good. But what happens immediately after that surgery, and in a lot of cases, pre-surgery too. You yourself know, Robert, that we got a lot better results when we were able to get an athlete that came in and you were able to change their nutrition and their supplementation prior to surgery.
100%.
And I was able to do prehab stuff to get them ready for surgery. I can't quantify it, but the results were a lot better. So now you take that same athlete that comes post-surgery and the surgeon does a great job, but he has to fly back to, I don't know, and I'm not picking on Boise, Idaho, but I'm just picking the city, right? Yeah. They don't get the quality of the rehab that they're supposed to get for an athlete, let's make sure to be specific about that.
Yep.
Rehab for an athlete is different than rehab for my 93-year-old mom. There comes a point where they have to get field ready, or what I call game ready. And there's a big gray area to be filled between the time when the PT lets you go after doing 6 weeks post-surgery ACL and you're ready to step on the field. And if that's not done properly, then that'll set you up in a pattern where you're more susceptible for other injuries mechanically. And in my humble opinion, you're susceptible for TBI because you just don't manage your gravity line like you would normally. So it's impossible for you to accept ground force and dissipate it, take a blow from Robert and dissipate it in a safer manner because of the previous injury. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. I was lecturing for the NHL back in June, and what was so fascinating was watching hours of tapes and footage of just poor posture, poor gravity line of an athlete running, but their list of what their complaints were. This knee is bad. This hip is bad. But if you really map them out and you just draw planes of where their shoulders should be in that movement, where their hip should be, if they're out of whack, not only are they prone to injure another part of the body, bad footing, bad shoulder, bad footing, bad hip. You could blow out an elbow having a bad hip, right? We all know that from Tommy John surgery. Just look at a pitcher's hips. That plays a big role. But what fascinates me is this whole talk of TBI. Don't rehab right, have really horrendous gravity, really horrendous understanding of your position on the field, injury, you know? And I understand you want to account for disruptions in the field, right? We know some great baseball players that loved their stories, and I love listening to the stories of them growing up in areas of the Dominican Republic, playing on a field that's not perfectly level, having balls bounce all over the place, and they could catch them in field anything. And of course, they turn into be some of the best baseball players in the world. This is a different story. If your body mechanics are off from the beginning and you're out there trying to play a contact sport like hockey or football, wow. Now I can completely see, and it's bringing back cases in my mind, Ben, of people that may have, because when we worked on the same athletes, not everyone was a choir person, right? A choir boy or girl. Right. They would either do everything you're saying 100%, drop off what I'm trying to tell them, or vice versa. And it has to go hand in hand. You have to have that aspect. You know, the work that you're doing is so critical and profound to that athlete being game ready. There's no shortcuts.
Absolutely. And the key component, you hit on it, is team. You have to collaborate with a group of like-minded, progressive individuals that are experts in their field, because I would rather stay in my own lane and be an expert on the mechanical portion of it and concede to people that are a lot smarter in the other areas. But you need to have a global understanding because listen, if you look, it's just like the injury. If you look at an athlete's blood work and you never met an athlete before, you can look at certain variables in their blood work and go, it's not if this is going to happen, it's when this is going to happen, based on the data that I see here, and I've never met the athlete. So it's the same for me. It's like, okay, if I see a guy that's had an ankle or a knee or whatever it is, pick the injury, and they haven't rehabbed it properly, and they're in a contact sport, there's no question that athlete is more susceptible, because that athlete doesn't have the ability to dissipate force the same way because of the prior injury. So rather than make a better helmet, how do we create protocols that prepare the athlete better to accept force, to accept contact?
That's an interesting statement. And it makes me think of what you guys are doing now. Is there anything you can share with me as president of Gray Matter Sports Group, anything about the 5-tier method of rehabbing an athlete post-TBI, traumatic brain injury, for those that may not know? Could you share any of that with our listeners, Ben?
Yeah. So Initially it was 5 tiers, and I would say you can still divide it into 5 tiers, but every athlete that comes in, we look at 3 major components. We look at neurological, which we initially broke down into 2 tiers, one vestibular and one more central nervous system oriented. The second one is biochemical, which we spoke about, which that's your field of excellence. The third is more mechanical, which we look at both what's the condition of the soft tissue and how can manual treatment help that. So is there a fixation at C012? Do they have internal rotation on the shoulder? Do they have a lack of scapular function here that a therapist can help them with? Do they have a tight psoas, whatever? And then I come in and go, hey, how's that athlete managing their gravity line? So in other words, what's their posture? And when the layman thinks of posture, they think what our mothers told us, right? Sit up straight, put your shoulders back, which is, yeah, it's valid. But when we look at posture, we're looking at where does the brain perceive that it is in space at all times? And what information is the musculoskeletal system giving the brain as to where it is in space, and vice versa? What's afferent, what's ascending, and what's efferent, what's descending? And what, for lack of a better term, what's screwed up? Is the eye giving the body bad information because of that first TBI? Or is the ankle giving the eye, the inner ear, the cervical spine, the brain bad information because that ankle injury was rehabbed improperly? And how do we get that athlete back to a good gravity line, a good posture, so that they're in a better position to accept force, to dissipate force?
Wow.
We're not going to get rid of concussions, but how do we provide a better insurance policy?
Yeah, right? I was gonna say you can't, we're not going to make that go away.
Right. To the same thing as, like, you tell your athlete, hey, listen, you know what? I know you're a football player, but dude, if you eat this way, you're going to have a better environment for that daily contact and for that one event. You're going to be better prepared for that. Manual therapy, we need to be more proactive in our model.
Absolutely.
We're going to plug in your treatments rather than wait until you feel pain or that you're not performing better, because in most cases that's late. It's too late. It's being reactive. So, hey, Robert, I'm not sleeping is late versus, hey, Robert, I want to look at my blood work to optimize everything so I sleep better.
Yeah, and that's athletes need to be reactive. Athletes need to be proactive, not reactive. Pardon is what I'm saying. Athletes need to be proactive, not reactive. Because what they do, Ben, is this is what I say a lot on the podcast, and please feel free to disagree if you disagree. But when I talk about a professional athlete, just amazing. You think of a hockey goalie, a phenomenal goalie, all those saves. Those movements are not natural. Then I think of the pitcher that's coming out there, 6 foot and change, going to throw anywhere between a changeup to a fastball, maybe have between 77 to 90-something miles per hour. That's going to last for maybe 7 innings. Not one arm, not natural. You got the great golfers. You got Tiger Woods. All that explosiveness, the positioning you need to be in just to be able to be perfect posturally for playing a game of golf. Not natural. So you're making the body move in an unnatural way. And the job I had when I was working in that field, and I believe you still have this day, is how can we do everything we can to mitigate injury risk as best as we possibly can in an unnatural movement realm. It's just, and obviously football, guys running into each other that are very large. You want to dissipate as much force as possible, but these are all unnatural things. So it requires so much more work. And also what I've noticed, that, you know what? That's why I love when you said, I work with a group of people, we'll get on the phone, we'll meet, we'll have meetings and talk about these N of 1 cases. That is how you really build a practice. You learn amazing stuff at a university level. Nothing is then going to educate you the way it is when you're out in the field actually applying your craft, and how many things change. And one of the neat things that happened is Raul got to tell some really key components of his life when he was working with me. And no one says it better than Raul, not to put words in his mouth, but on this podcast, he said, after winning the World Series as a young man, his ankles killed him in the morning and he could not run 40 yards. After I did one thing, I did a lot with Raul, but I did one thing. I identified his immunological relationship to what he was consuming to nourish himself, i.e. his diet was something he consuming, just reacting immunologically in a way that would promote more of the inflammatory cascade he obviously was experiencing. He said after 7 days of me identifying and him doing all the work and avoiding those foods, he could then run 100 yards without pain. Right? So what's neat about athletes is the challenges, they're doing things that are unnatural. We have to work harder to keep them as safe as they can because their sport puts them in a higher state of injury than a CEO. That would be one hell of a dangerous position if I'm wrong there, if that's for that CEO. Right? I don't think Bezos is having the risk of one of your hockey players or linebackers on a game-to-game basis for him, right? No. Not in his quarterly board meetings. I don't think so. They seem to be doing well. But I also think they respond. Here's what I'd like to know. I think they respond quicker than the average person to a course of action, a treatment modality that is on target. Do you feel that with an athlete versus the lay public?
Yeah, I definitely see that when the athlete complies with what we give them, they respond much quicker. I think that they have, obviously, to be at the level that they're participating and playing in their sport and getting paid for their sport, they have highly developed nervous systems. And I think that that's one of the areas in the field of sports science that's young and that's being looked at by some of the smarter guys in the field, is really understanding how to be able to get the athlete in a parasympathetic state. Every one of the athletes that you and I have worked with that operate at a high level talk about the game slowing down when they perform at their best and being in what's referred to as a flow state, or however you want to call it. And in my humble opinion, I feel like, again, those three components play a huge part. So what is your biochemical environment that allows you to get into a parasympathetic state quicker? Or do you have responses that don't allow you to? What is your environment mechanically that contributes to you getting into a parasympathetic state quicker? Or do you have components of that interfere with it? And what's your program-wise recovery, including soft tissue and everything else that allows you to get into a sympathetic state? Or do you have nagging, aches and injuries and stuff that you don't deal with by getting the proper treatment that prohibits you from getting in that sympathetic state? And I think ultimately the more we know about that, the higher our athletes will perform and the better our results will be.
Yeah, I agree. There's so much, and we have so many colleagues that are working in different areas, and I believe teamwork is the only answer to help mitigate as much risk as we possibly can in sports, these contact sports, and in sports where there may not be contact, like your work in track and field and your work with the women's team. That's very rewarding, and I'm assuming that area is less risk for concussion, but so much greater risk for mechanical injury.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah. And would you approach, Ben, a very similar case to those types of athletes that are injured in the complete total absence of a concussion? Are you still looking at the biochemistry components and the whole spectrum as you're doing with TBI, or is it a little modified?
No, I absolutely do. And for me, in a perfect world, every athlete that came to see me would go see my colleagues because the results would be exponentially better. And I learned really early on in my career when I worked with that track and field team, we had a 110-meter hurdler. She was one of the best in the world, and she doesn't mind me sharing her name, Michelle Freeman. She was an absolute beast. And She had a multiple tibia fracture during a race, which she actually finished. It was horrific to watch, but on the last hurdle, she snapped her tibia. And the doctors couldn't figure out what was going on because it was a non-contact injury, and she was extremely strong. She wasn't on any PED. She was natural. She was just gifted. But after, when we sent her information to Dr. Serrano, he asked for some blood work, and it came back that she wasn't absorbing boron, and along with several other minerals. And so that early on in my career showed me, wait a minute, you need to know these details when you're dealing with a high level athlete, because, an athlete like that, you need to know that right away, and you need to mitigate that right away, because she potentially hurt her ability to win a medal in her entire career because of that one injury. And it was something that, guys will look, therapists were looking at her like, what is going on here mechanically? And it wasn't. It was a biochemical issue with her. So that happens in the concussion space, and it happens outside of the concussion space. And to me, it's one big gray area.
Absolutely. And it's something I did a webinar on endurance athletes a while ago with some experts in the field. And I brought up, my work with some track and field stars, and without even them knowing it, Ben, they were, especially the women, they were victims of the female athlete triad, where they were just crushing calories and not putting enough back, under consuming macronutrients, and ended up having early track of osteopenia, the precursor to osteoporosis, and then of course at a greater risk for fracture. One of the routine things that I would do all the time, I didn't care how fit the athlete was. They would come in to see me. Part of my work included just looking at a fracture risk. We needed to have baseline data there, because too many great athletes, I would see some just tremendous injury. And yes, you can never stop every single break. But if you see warning signs on decarboxylated osteocalcin is elevated, a DEXA scan just seems a little what? Especially with a female athlete, you're thinking, how could that be possible? Right. I saw that in track and field. I saw baseball players where I said, I think a fracture is going to happen. I had one guy said, no, third week of the season, snap. So it's unfortunate, but you would see the predictive data there. So I felt like we had to be so on our toes in our respective crafts to find every single risk factor there was, and then try to mitigate it. And the hardest part was the mitigation was really the person sitting across from you that you're educating, right? So yeah, 90% of your athletes are going to listen to you. And then there are some that wouldn't, But
that's a problem.
It's a problem. But Ben, one of the things I've also found very interesting with you, I want to go back to what you were talking about, posture and postural type exercises. Could you talk about your work in that realm, please? And how posture, how you define it, your work in that area, and how it impacts human health?
Yeah, so, wow, that's a great question. I recently, less than a month ago, I took part one of a international board certified kind of license to be a posturologist. And it's based on the work of Dr. Brico, who's, I can't remember his first name, but he is a neuroscientist out of Marseille, France. And I took a class with him years ago, and it talked about the postural system and its effects on health. And I kind of kept that information in my pocket. And now when I started working with concussions, I revisited it and I took the course, which is now very well organized. And it's taught by a woman, which I'll get you her information. You need to have her on the podcast. She's very smart, PT out of Montreal. Anyway, long story short, they look at posture from the standpoint of that the eyes, meaning the muscles of the eyes, not the vision, and the bottom of the feet, along with the jaw and the inner ear, provide information to the brain as to where it is in space 24 hours a day. It's much more complicated than that, but they have a really good system to assess the foot and the eye's role in the patient's posture. And so we utilize this system as part of our assessment with the athletes, both to get a baseline and B, to kind of go back to and say, hey, you know what, you've had your bell rung and we want to correct these issues, and look what an impact they had on your posture based on the initial baseline tests. So we're utilizing that work and the work of Dr. Brico along with the work of Dr. Guy Voyer in terms of rehab. But from a general standpoint, to answer your question, it goes back to the effect of posture on the autonomic nervous system. So for the listeners, good posture can contribute to homeostasis within the autonomic nervous system, or bad posture will contribute to it being out of whack or non-homeostasis. And in most cases, it's going to be a sympathetic response. So if you have a patient that presents a poor posture, meaning they have an anterior tilt, their brain is getting information that's not accurate as to where they are in space. So they're not in a constant struggle. They don't know that it's 2018. They think, oh, wait, I must flee from this tiger. So all these sympathetic responses go up, heart rate goes up, respiratory rate goes up, dopamine levels go up, and you have all of this, in your words, this biochemical cascade that occurs on a constant basis that demands all of this ATP from the brain, because it's getting all this conflicting information as to, am I falling forward? Am I not falling forward? My eyes are telling me this, but the bottom of my foot is telling me this. So it's never in that parasympathetic state that you and I strive to get the athletes to. I don't know if that was a little too long-winded, a little too complicated, but
I think it's excellent. I also think in that answer, you and I need to petition the American Medical Association to rename TBI getting your bell rung. Why BR instead of TBI? So, so please pardon my sense of humor. You know,
no, I love it. Yeah, it's no box.
I think that's a very, no, I love that. I really, by the way, someone who over orders a steak, there was one server at a restaurant that said, you can't unring the bell. So leave it to New York City restaurants.
Right.
One of the things I wanted to bring up is talking about that and having just a change in posture that's incorrect for your own physicality and how that affects the nervous system. I'd like to just discuss something that's extremely well known in science and medicine that unfortunately not enough people know. Something as simple as, and pardon, I know this sounds funny and I'm trying not to be flippant, I'm really being serious here. If you just are holding in urine and you're stuck behind your desk, or back in the practicing days, you're working with a patient and you just don't go to the bathroom, just that process raises blood pressure. I just want to make it very clear that there is a biochemical cascade to just holding in number one. I'm sure there's a worse biochemical cascade with holding in number two. But when you got, so there's serious increase in blood pressure can transpire in someone. So the tiniest change in blood pressure in someone who's already hypertensive is not a good thing. We also know the same thing about our bodies being exposed to temperature change, right? There's so many fascinating stories about cryogenic chambers, and saunas were so big when I was coming up in the field, Ben, and infrared, near infrared, all of that. But again, going back to temperature, you know, Harvard talked about in 2010, the most heart attacks transpire on a Monday when it's freezing outside. And I'm going to throw in, you're holding in your pee to get to the office. So you have this perfect storm of all these various things that are happening to our bodies, and our awareness of that is transpiring neurochemically, whether we like it or not. So I found it fascinating what you're doing with posture. I think that's amazing. I think it's extremely, the reason I think it's cutting edge is I think it's just not done. In all my years in working in with pro athletes, consulting with different experts, that never came up. You know, from some of my colleagues that are working in the realms neurologically, other colleagues that are working from a corrective osteopathic chiropractic perspective, and I think you know who I'm talking about. All great work. No one was looking at that aspect. And I think what you're onto there and what you're doing there is groundbreaking, and I congratulate you on that, my friend. That's awesome.
Well, thank you. And I think to add to your example about the heart attacks on a Monday in cold weather, that same person is shoveling snow. So they're in a forward flex position, elevating their heart rate with probably a lot of clothing on. And so they're restricting what would be normal function of their diaphragm, their pericardium, because of the position that they're in as well. So there's a mechanical component to that. And then there are a lot of really good practitioners out there that are now being exposed to the importance of posture to health and wellness, not just performance. But the problem is the research is lacking because we're the only mammal, maybe with the exception of chimpanzees, that are bipodal. And so looking at the posture of a rat versus the posture of a human is completely different. So it's one of those topics that we never know if we're going to have a lot of the answers, because you can't really look at how how improving posture is going to affect mitigating the risk factor of a TBI. If you're studying rats. It's not going to happen.
It's not going to happen.
So the anecdotal stuff that we're getting from good practitioners is very important, validated by all of the biomarkers and the different data points that we're now able to take. So you can say, hey, yeah, my treatment plan works because look at this. Look at HRV, look at resting heart rate, look at his blood work, and look at the VO2 max prior to it, that kind of stuff. So that's kind of the direction it's going in.
And then a spreadsheet of like injury profile, games benched, games played. There's so much data that comes out of that. And I can't say enough when we were about the N of 1. I can't say enough about the N of 1. When I did my webinar on various types of endurance athletes and how we looked at specific modalities, all we kept sharing were N of 1 studies, because everybody's biochemically unique. Yes, oh my God, come on, man, I'm a PhD. Of course, studies are so critical. Peer-reviewed research is so critical. But when you're really working one-on-one, there only is this one athlete X. There's no publication on this individual sitting across from me at their time in life. And I've always loved the aspect of what biomedical informatics is. The mantra is it's the right drug for the right person at the right time. And you could substitute drug with so many different pieces of that puzzle of having individualized medicine. And that's really where we're headed, right? I mean, you could even look at a cartoon of a young man that never smoked a day in his life in a hospital bed with stage 4 lung cancer, and the uncle who's 70 going to visit him who chain smokes filterless, and he's completely as healthy as could be. Anyway, yeah, thank you, Ben. I know how busy your life is. I just want you to know this meant the world to me. My listeners are going to love this. I can't thank you enough. If you have 2 minutes, could you please tell our listeners how they can reach out and find more about you, maybe get on board with hiring your services, any information you have about how they could look you up, please. And Gray Matters.
Thank you, Robert. So you can look up my name, which is my website is just Ben Velasquez, and that's BenVelazquez.com. On social media, just look me up, Ben Velasquez, on Instagram and on Facebook. And then we have a podcast, myself and my colleague, Dr. Janopoulos, and it's called the ThrivalistManifesto.com. And essentially, we just look at everything from academics to athletes to successful people that we interview. And we try to get behind how they thrive. And there's always an element of human performance. And we interviewed the great Dr. Robert Pastore on there as well. So your listeners can listen to that interview, which we kind of got really geeky about celiac disease and gluten. So it's a great interview. That's where you can find me. And thank you so much, Robert. I'll do it whenever you want. This is fun.
Right back at you, my friend. Thanks so much, Ben. Be well, my friend. I'll talk to you soon, okay?
You too, B. Bye-bye.